Good evening. I'm delighted to welcome you to Personal Conversations, part of the suite of educational programs for members of Women's League for Conservative Judaism. In the Personal Conversations series, we try to take a deeper look at matters that are in our hearts and on our minds as Jews and as women. It's about how we each live our lives. I'm Vivian Lieber, the chair of Women's League's Personal Conversations and member of the board. The prior sessions in this series may be replayed from the WLCJ.org website under the Online Programs tab. Tonight's program will run for about an hour and a quarter, and it's being recorded. Within a few days afterwards, the link to the recording will be posted on the WLCJ website. Tonight's program is entitled Discovering and Sharing Our Genetic Information. Debbie Goldich, Women's League International President, has another commitment tonight and has asked me to extend to you her greetings. Later in this program, we'll also hear from Women's League Executive Director, Rabbi Ellen Wolensfield, who is here tonight. And also working with us is Grace Chesler, a Women's League Vice President and Chair of Programming, and also staff member of Women's League, Isabel. Now it's my honor to introduce to you our two special presenters. As our first presenter is beginning, you may enter questions for her in the chat box. We'll select question as time allows after her presentation. Now, first, I'd like to introduce Faye. Faye Shapiro is a board-certified genetic counselor with over 25 years of clinical experience, including experience in prenatal, pediatric, and cancer genetics. She currently works in the Department of Pediatrics at Cooper Medical Center in Camden, New Jersey. Her primary responsibilities include evaluating children and adults with birth defects, developmental disabilities, and specific health conditions, reviewing family histories, helping to determine the appropriate genetic tests to order, and helping families understand the results with respect to how the disorder occurred and how it is transmitting through the family. You'll hear some of this tonight. Outside of work, Faye is active in her synagogue congregation, Bethel, in Voorhees, New Jersey. Faye is a past sisterhood president and currently serves on the board of trustees as vice president. She is a regular Torah reader on Shabbat mornings and Yom Tov, and she is a B'nai Mitzvah tutor. Faye is married to Gary, a family physician, and they have 3 children. I think after Faye presents, I will introduce to you our second speaker, Dr. Lori Zoloff. But for now, I am very pleased to invite Faye to tell us about what she does and why this is such a fascinating subject that we've all been reading about, but we really want to know more.
Thank you. Thanks for having me tonight. It's an honor to be speaking and presenting to all of you. I was sort of asked to cover topics, the topic, when is it advisable to seek medical genetic testing, and what is the genetic counselor's role? So I think in order to do that, it's kind of important first to sort of start out with explaining what different types of genetic testing, what different types of genetic tests are. And then we can talk a little bit about what you can learn from some versus the other. And then I'll talk about why you would actually undergo diagnostic genetic testing as opposed to the kind that you can order yourself online. So, when we talk about genetic testing, everybody thinks, oh, BRCA gene, because of course that's what most people are familiar with. But really, genetic testing can be broken down into 3 categories. There is single gene tests like BRCA, where we basically sequence genes looking for spelling mistakes. We also use this type of genetic testing when we do expanded carrier screening for pregnant couples, things like that. Then there's also sort of our good old standby chromosome testing, which has evolved over the years. But in order to, usually before we start looking at genes, we often look at chromosomes, make sure we have the right number, the right All the chromosomes are there. There's no extra missing whole chromosomes or missing chromosomes. Conditions like Down syndrome, Turner syndrome, or maybe you've heard of like 22q deletion syndrome. Those would be things you'd find from a chromosome test. And then of course we have protein tests or biochemical tests. That's where you actually look for the chemical that the gene is making, because if it's deficient, then it might indicate that you have that genetic disorder. And that's actually how we used to do Tay-Sachs testing, like back in the 70s and 80s, before we actually discovered the gene for Tay-Sachs. We actually looked at the enzyme level of HEX-A. There's a normal level. If you had a level that was about half of normal, you were a carrier. And a baby that had none of this chemical at all would be affected. So often we use a combination though, because it's really important to realize that genetic testing isn't perfect. Even though we have identified, the vast majority of our functional genes in our body, we still can't guarantee that we can find 100% of the mistakes when we do genetic testing. So sometimes you have to combine different types of tests to kind of get your final answer. So anyways, for the rest of this talk, I'm kind of going to focus on gene tests, because I think that's what most of us, if we were to pursue any type of genetic testing now, that's what we'd be doing. And we can pretty much divide gene tests into testing that you can order yourself online, which I will just simply call direct-to-consumer testing. You do not need a physician involved to order this type of testing. And you can get some useful information and a lot of fun information from these types of tests. And the second category would be, of course, the diagnostic genetic tests. And we kind of need to understand the difference between the two, and then it'll be kind of obvious when you would pursue one versus the other. So, the main difference between the two, or I shouldn't say obviously, but the main difference between the two is that a test that you can order yourself online without any type of oversight from a healthcare professional is not going to give you the same amount or the same level of accuracy as a test that your doctor would order, right? And of course, the process, what they're looking for in those tests are a little bit different as well. Whereas a diagnostic genetic test usually involves sequencing a gene, looking for the actual spelling mistakes that would be associated with a particular condition, basically to determine if that gene is working or not. And if it's not, what is that chemical that gene is supposed to be making that your body is missing, which often helps in treatment and management plans. Okay, so some people wonder, why do we do the direct to consumer if it's not as accurate as diagnostic testing? I mean, the main reason, because first of all, it's easy. You can order it on your own. And it's fun. The information you get from direct to consumer is it's entertaining in a way, but you do get some useful health information. So I'm not going to pinpoint or call out any one particular direct to consumer type of test, but these are the kind that you can order online. I think they even sell them in Target. Many people use them for ancestry, but they've expanded quite a bit over the years that you can get some useful health information. So again, what are the types of information you get from direct to consumer tests? Again, ancestry. That's usually the main reason why most people do these kinds of tests. You want to know, where'd you come from? Are you really what you think you are? And some of them, I think if you pay more money, you can even find some of your long lost relatives. And that's actually pretty powerful for some people. And I know people that have done that. You can also find out about your physical traits, your hair color, your eye color. Do you have a widow's peak, a unibrow, freckles, ear wax, cleft chin, things like that. I mean, I think if you have a mirror in your house, you can probably find out most of those answers as well. But some people like to get, a piece of paper that shows, oh yeah, I do have brown hair. I do have brown eyes. Like that's what I was supposed to have. So those genes are working right in me. But then you also get some useful health information, right? Some of the direct-to-consumer tests will offer certain carrier tests, which are important for couples planning a pregnancy, right? You want to make sure that you and your partner aren't both carriers for the same recessive genetic disorder, because if you are, then you pass it on at the same time. You could have a baby with one of these disorders, and they're usually pretty severe, often life-threatening types of disorders. And you can get tested for some of these through direct to consumer. Not nearly as many as you can be tested for through your OBGYN or your primary care physician in what we now call expanded carrier testing. And the other thing is the result from the direct to consumer test is limited. When they say they're testing you for, I'll use Tay-Sachs as an example, they're really only looking at the 3 or 4 common variants in the Tay-Sachs gene that we see in Jewish people. If you're not Jewish, this test wasn't relevant to you. So even though you're getting tested for, I think it's maybe up to about 40 conditions, some of those conditions aren't necessarily prevalent in your specific ethnic group, and they're only focusing on the specific gene changes that are prevalent in that ethnic group. So it's not full sequencing of the genes, you're not getting as accurate a result. But if you are found to be a carrier for something through direct to consumer testing, you probably are. So what they do test for, it's accurate, but there's a lot that they don't test for. They started recently adding a little bit of pharmacogenetics. I don't know if you're familiar with pharmacogenetics, but that's where we can analyze certain genes to determine how your body metabolizes certain medications. Again, it's very limited what the direct-to-consumer panels offer you. If you're truly having an issue with specific types of medication or specific classes of medication, you might do better with a diagnostic panel that looks at many more genes, particularly the one that might affect the class of medication that you're on. So right now, what you can get through the direct-to-consumer is very, very limited. And then they do have FDA approval to test for certain health risks, right? They can look at specific gene changes the same way a diagnostic test would in specific genes. But again, it's very limited to the number of variants, right? They're not sequencing any of these genes. For example, BRCA1 and 2 are on some of the direct-to-consumer panels. It's only the 3 common Jewish variants, which for us, that's helpful, right? It's useful to us, but it's not useful to everybody. So it's just very important with that type of testing that you read the limitations or understand that if they did a test for sickle cell disease, they were only looking at the common variants in African American people where that gene or that disorder is more prevalent. Is it likely that you're going to be a carrier for sickle cell or have sickle cell? Of course not, because you're not of that high risk group, but anybody can have anything. Okay, genes aren't specific and unique to certain groups. They're just more prevalent in certain ethnic groups. Okay, and it's very important to understand that while you will get useful information, it's not as useful, or it may not be as useful. And it really depends on why you did the test in the first place. If you just did it for fun and you weren't really concerned about your health or your risks going into any of those, well, you have some fun information and some useful information you can have. And the last thing they usually give you is your option to purchase your raw data or download your raw data. I'm sorry, I don't think you have to purchase it. And that's where it gets really confusing, because your raw data is just that. These companies look at thousands and thousands of what we call polymorphisms in your DNA. So it's not actually looking for mistakes. It's looking at normal variation that makes you different from me. And, we all have different eye color, hair color, structure, body builds, intelligence, things like that. We have lots of variation in our genes. And that's what they're looking at. But then they can somehow take that conglomerate data and say, well, based on these normal variants that you have, you're more likely to get certain health conditions. And the raw data, there are companies online that for a fee, you can upload your raw data and they will give you even more health information. And there's some that are for nutrition. Upload your raw data, will tell you what the best diet for you is. And here's some menu plans. And there's ones on fitness. Upload your raw data and we'll tell you what your muscle build is like and which exercises work best for you. And they're all for a fee. So if you want that kind of information, it's good. It's not necessarily scientific or regulated to the extent of diagnostic testing, but like I said, it's fun. If there's something particular you're trying to learn about yourself, you might be able to get it from direct to consumer. But again, I like to think of it as recreational genetics. It's fun in conversation with your friends. You might learn a little bit about, whether you like cilantro or not, if you didn't know that already, or whether whether your face flushes when you drink red wine. Again, you might already know this, but now you have proof for it. So lots of reasons to do direct to consumer. Of course, they don't take insurance. It's all fee for service. So naturally, it's only obtained by people, that can afford to do it. So much of their data and their information comes from a white European ancestry background, which again, it's fine for us because that's what we are. We benefit. The more data they have from our population, the more accurate the results are for us. Might not be quite as accurate for other ethnic groups though. Comparing that, so that's direct to consumer. The bigger question is, why would one then go to have diagnostic testing then? So diagnostic testing is really more of a medical test, right? You're at risk for something, either because of your own history or something in your family, and you want to know if you have it or not, right? And typically, although we can do test and diagnostic testing for just about every health category of health conditions, cancer, cardiac, neuro, whatever, the real reason to pursue it is if the result is going to help or change or benefit your medical management in some way, or that of one of your relatives, like someone in your family. Because remember, anything you have, there's a 50% chance you pass to your kids. Your siblings are at risk. So your genetic test results don't necessarily only affect you, they can affect other people in the family as well. So again, if the result of the genetic test is going to benefit you in some way, then by all means you should do it. Of course, most people have heard of, I'll use BRCA again, just because many of us are already familiar with cancer genetic testing. If you have a strong family history of any type of cancer, breast cancer, ovarian cancer, colon cancer, there are genes for that, right? That doesn't mean that you have the gene. Most cancer is not hereditary, right? But some of it is. About 10% of cancers that occur at a young age or multiple people in the same family, is hereditary. And genetic testing has really made us able to better quantify our risks, right? If you're maybe 30 or 40 years old and your mother had breast cancer when she was 50 and your aunt had breast cancer when she was 40 and maybe somebody else, you're at increased risk for breast cancer. We know from statistics from looking at large population studies. But if someone in your family who's had cancer has undergone genetic testing and finds out that they carry an actual variant in one of these genes, now the rest of the family has very useful information, because now you can be tested, because if you didn't get that gene from your mother, you don't have that same increased risk as she had. You drop down to the general population. You don't have no risk. Of course you have risk. Every woman has risk, but it might save you from some of the increased screening and a lot of worrying that you might do, right? So people that undergo cancer gene testing, again, the result may not just help you, but it may also help your relatives. And when I say you have the BRCA gene, we all have the BRCA gene. We all have all of these genes, right? And we all have two copies, one from our mother, one from our father. What I'm talking about is a change, a variant, a spelling mistake in one of those copies that's making one copy not work right. And it's also important to realize that none of these genes have 100% risk for cancer, okay? Because something still has to happen to the other copy, the one that was previously working right from your other parent. And for some people, nothing happens. They go their whole lives and they never get cancer, which is why none of these genes have 100% risk. But it's definitely significantly higher than someone in the general population. And we all acquire mistakes in our genes as we age, just through the normal aging process, through environmental exposures, chemicals in the foods that we eat, pollution in the air, things like that. So we're always acquiring mistakes in genes in single cells, but when we say someone has a change in one of these cancer genes, that would be a change that they were born with, that they inherited from one of their parents. And again, almost every category of medicine, there are genes for different cardiac conditions, arrhythmias, cardiomyopathies, hypercholesterolemia, neurological conditions like neuropathies, neuromuscular conditions, even some forms of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and those, we have found genes that link to all of those conditions. We can test, but again, only if there's a reason, right? For cancer, I'll go back to cancer just because it's a we have a lot of experience with it. We don't just offer cancer testing to everybody, though. I guess we could. People could choose to do it if they wanted to pay for it out of pocket. But the truth is, we kind of have criteria. As much as every woman's at risk for breast cancer, only some people are really at risk for hereditary breast cancer, right? There has to be a certain pattern to the family history, to the age of diagnosis in the family, like younger ages, more people affected, if someone had more than one cancer, things like that. So there is criteria that we usually go by, either through the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, or some insurance companies even have their own criteria. And if you meet it, it means you're a good candidate for genetic testing. It doesn't always mean we're going to find something, but that's kind of how we determine who should have genetic testing or not. Because again, if you're positive, you're entitled to increased screening. You're entitled to your insurance company to pay for it. Not just one mammogram every year, but maybe a mammogram and an MRI every year. If it's colon cancer, instead of going every 10 years, you get to go every 3 to 5 years for your colonoscopy, things like that. But, there are things that would change in your medical management if you tested positive. Same with some of the cardiac conditions. We already know if you have a first degree relative with some of those things, especially like cardiomyopathy or a cardiac arrhythmia, we know you're at higher risk. You're destined for more screening than the general population. And here's where the genetic testing, again, could help. If someone has a specific gene change, you get tested and you don't have it, you don't have to do that increased screening that is typically recommended. Some people will do diagnostic testing to confirm the results that they found in direct-to-consumer testing. Most of those laboratories have disclaimers that this is not intended for medical or diagnostic purposes. Therefore, any result that you get from a direct-to-consumer should be confirmed by your medical team, your healthcare professionals. Again, prenatal carrier screening, couples who are planning a pregnancy often undergo what's called expanded carrier screening now. It's not just Tay-Sachs anymore. And we don't even single out the Jewish people anymore. It's really for the whole population. It's kind of like, let's just screen everybody for everything. And hopefully if you are a carrier for something, we'll find it, right? And they're pretty accurate. I'm talking like over 200 diseases now, I think, is standard of care. And again, the best time is to do it before you actually get pregnant. But if you forgot or didn't know about it, or your OB didn't tell you until you actually went for that first prenatal visit, even early in the pregnancy is better than not at all, because finding out at birth that your baby has something that could potentially be life-threatening is usually not a good time to find out. Not that there ever is, but again, if you think about it and can do it prior to getting pregnant, that's the best time. Again, some people will do predictive or presymptomatic testing. Conditions like Huntington's disease, like pretty severe but later adult onset type conditions, people just want to know. I'm personally not one of them. I don't think I would want to know if I had an incurable progressive disease, but there are people that do. Sometimes it's more for reproductive purposes, like if they knew they had the gene, they wouldn't have biological children and risk passing it on. So, I mean, there's all kinds of reasons. It's not for us to judge, but it's just to make sure they understand what the test is going to show you. And last, of course, as I mentioned a little bit ago, pharmacogenomics is a huge kind of up and coming field in genetics. A lot of people that have a lot of issues with medication, a lot of the mental health type anxiety, antidepressant medications can be influenced by our genes. If you're really struggling because you're having a hard time finding one that works or finding the right dose, this can be helpful. Some of our neurologists use this type of testing for their patients, for seizure patients, to help them find the right seizure medication, or their autistic patients or their ADHD kids that need to be on medication. Again, just helps kind of cut out some of the trial and error that comes often with starting medication for the first time. So that's just kind of a lot of reasons why one might pursue diagnostic testing. Am I getting close to my time limit?
Yeah, we're going to have some questions, I know. So if you want to wrap it.
Yeah, well, the last thing I was going to talk about is what is the role of the genetic counselor. So the genetic counselor really is your healthcare professional whose sole job it is to help you figure out, is genetic testing right for you? And what is the right test? Like, we are trained to really take a close look at your family and medical histories to help you figure out, do you meet that criteria? Are you at significant risk for a condition that we can identify? And what is the right testing to do? And then probably most important, help you interpret the results when they come back, right? A laboratory will come back, the report will be either positive or negative, or that dreaded uncertain, right? Variant of uncertain significance, and nobody knows what to do with that. So I can't say that we actually have all the answers for that, but at least we can try to explain to you a little bit better about what that means. And then last, of course, is what happens if you're positive, right? What does it mean for you, first of all? Is it a disease you already have, or is it something you're at risk for? If it's something you're at risk for, what can you be doing to maybe either prevent it, diagnose it earlier before it gets to an advanced stage, those types of things. And then who should I be sharing this information with? As I said, anything that you have, your children are going to be at risk for, possibly your grandchildren. What does it mean to them? If they find out about it before they even have any symptoms, can we prevent it completely? Sometimes. Is there something they could be doing differently? Lifestyle changes, things like that. So, all of that, the genetic counselor will help you with. Many doctors order genetic testing on their own without a genetic counselor, which is fine. If you need help finding one, or if they didn't give you an explanation that you're comfortable with, you can always find genetic counselors online. And I'll have some resources that I'll share with Vivian that she could send to everybody that can help you.
Let me ask, I know so many questions on our mind, but what types of doctors have an avenue where they refer you to a genetic counselor? You mentioned to me in our phone conversation a little bit about that.
So that's tough. So obviously oncology has their own field. So most oncologists have either work with a center that has genetic counselors or have genetic counselors in their own centers. So that's easy. It's everything else that's hard, right? Some cardiologists will do their own genetic testing. Some neurologists will do their own genetic testing. Most of them will refer to, genetic centers, which typically are only in like your larger university medical centers. Like I work in pediatrics, but the geneticist I work for sees adults, and we're the only genetics people in our hospital. So technically anybody with a genetic issue can get referred to us, even though we're based in pediatrics.
Okay. We have a few questions. I'll allow, another 5 minutes because this is all very fascinating. So if parents are both carriers of a disease, is there some intervention or therapy, or I've heard of surgeries, things they can do to have a healthy child?
Right. So sometimes it depends on the disorder as to whether you would actually want to prevent a pregnancy versus just knowing about it or knowing that there's a risk so that you know to have the child tested at birth so that intervention can begin right away. But for those who want to avoid it completely, the only way we can do that is through in vitro fertilization with pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So if you know that you're both carriers, let's say for Tay-Sachs disease, right? And you know what the two variants that you have, even could be the same one, might be a different one, but you know them. If you get pregnant by in vitro fertilization, before they put the embryos into the mom, they can test them for Tay-Sachs status. And only the ones that are not found to be affected would be implanted in the mom. So
Okay.
that's the only true prevention. The other options would be early prenatal diagnosis with the option of terminating a pregnancy.
I'd like to know, and I know you can briefly, is there a potential for, or should we worry about discrimination once we have been genetically tested in terms of the rest of our lives?
Right.
And
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's a law that was passed in 2008 called the Genetics Information and Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA for short. And GINA basically says that you cannot be discriminated against by either your health insurance company or your employer based on any kind of genetic test results. It does not have any provisions for life insurance, though. So, but life insurance, the only experience, I haven't had much because I get it through work, but I feel like, they have underwriters that are, they're going to dig up your family history anyway. So if there's something in your family history that's concerning, you're probably going to get doinked for it regardless. But, a genetic test is just as private as any other medical test that your doctor orders for you, right? If you have a cholesterol level of 300 because your doctor ordered cholesterol levels, that's part of your medical record, right? So a result from a genetic test, really isn't any different. HIPAA laws that all medical facilities have to practice, they all come into play. They don't treat genetic test results any different.
okay, if any of our participants wants to get in touch with you, is that something?
Yeah, I'm going to give my email. And I just wanted to add one thing that I forgot to say. So in addition to direct to consumer, you can do what's called like patient initiated genetic testing. And that's with some of the commercial labs online. So let's say you want to do cancer testing because you have a strong family history of breast cancer, but your doctor, you don't live in an area with a genetics program anywhere near you. You can go online and it'll ask you, are you a patient or a provider? And if you're a patient, they will connect you with a third party. There are online genetic counseling and genetics companies around the country that provide this type of service for people that don't have a medical professional to order the test for them. So they'll set you up with a telemedicine type genetic session. And if the testing is appropriate, they'll get the test ordered for you. They ship you a saliva kit in the mail. You do it, you send it to the lab, and the results go back to that genetic counselor that ordered the test for you. So it's really becoming much easier if your primary care doctor, who really doesn't know much, nothing against primary care doctors, and my husband is one, but they don't have the time or really know much about, all these different types of genetic tests.
So, okay, would you share with us how we can reach you? And
Yeah.
also, maybe you want to mention one resource for further information people can, a book, an article, a website.
Yeah,
What's
sure.
first of all, your email address, if that's.
Do you want me to put it in the chat?
Typed in the chat box.
Yeah. Hold on, I have to change it to everyone. There we go. Yeah, like I'm happy
more private that way.
Right. I'm happy to suggest things to people privately. I'm not comfortable endorsing any one lab or company over another in a public type
And
forum.
also, is there any website people could go to for further information that you'd recommend?
Um, there's a few. I mean, for carrier screening, I'll send it to you like in
Maybe
an
if you
I
send
have
us
a
later,
list.
we'll share it with the
Yeah, if you
participants
can share it.
afterwards.
And there's also like a website if you're just more interested in genetics in general and genes and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. There's some really nice educational type
We
websites.
didn't get to everything we wanted to ask you also, but
That's okay.
thank you so much. And please stay on and we will have much more. And thank you so much, Faye. Well, I'll be back to you a little later.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say one thing. I put in the chat the wonderful website of JUF Chicago's Jewish Genetics. The JUF in Chicago has been really led the way and nationally in setting up a center years ago, 25 years ago, setting up a center. You can get screening to the center. They have genetic counselors available who know a lot about Jews and genes and thought a lot about this. It's a tremendous resource that you might think about it, and you should urge your JU, wherever you are, to do something similar for the Jews in the community. They do a lot of great educational work as well.
Thank you. Okay, with that, you just heard from Dr. Lori Zoloff. I would first thank you so much, Faye. It was a wonderful presentation. We learned a lot, and we're hungry to learn even more. And now it's my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Lori Zoloff. And when while she's speaking, if anyone has a question, they could put it in the chat box to direct it to either Grace Chesler or myself is the best way to do it. With that, welcome, Professor Lori Zoloff.
Well,
Dr. Zoloff is one of today's leading thinkers on bioethics. She was recommended to me for today's program by our friend Rabbi Elliot Zorf, a distinguished professor and rector of the American Jewish University, who he had addressed us in last year's Women's League Personal Conversations program about organ donation. Rabbi Dorf and Dr. Zoloff are co-authors and editors of the book published in 2016, Jews and Genes, The Genetic Future in Contemporary Jewish Thought. And they're always in touch. Currently at the University of Chicago, Lori Zoloff is the Margaret E. Burton Professor of Religion and Ethics in the Divinity School and the Senior Advisor to the Provost for Programs on Social Ethics. She also is on the faculty of the Pritzker School of Medicine. A leader in the field of religious studies and with particular scholarly interest in bioethics and Jewish studies, Dr. Zoloff's research explores religion and ethics, drawing from sources ranging from biblical and Talmudic texts to postmodern Jewish philosophy. Her scholarship spans the ethics of genetic engineering, stem cell research, synthetic biology, social justice in healthcare, and how science and medicine are taught. She also researches the practice of interreligious dialogue, exploring how religion plays a role in public discussion and policy. She serves on the advisory boards of organizations and their bioethics committees, including such as NASA, the CDC, Center for Disease Control, and the American Heart Association. Dr. Zoloff holds a bachelor's degree in women's studies from the University of California, Berkeley, and a bachelor's degree also in nursing from the University of the State of New York. She received a master's degree in Jewish studies, a doctorate in social ethics from the Graduate Theological Union. Dr. Zoloff also holds a master's degree in English from San Francisco State University. She's had a very rich background. Earlier in her career, she was a professor at Northwestern University and the founding director of its medical school's bioethics program. With that, it's my pleasure to allow Lori, as you asked us to call you, tell us about her work, her field, and all the things that we are been curious about from this changing field of genetics.
Well, of course, I'm a University of Chicago person and teach at the med school too, so I have an elaborate slideshow presentation, but I was advised not to use PowerPoint. So I'm just going to talk it through, okay? And I don't mind if you interrupt, by the way. I'm fine with interruption. I'm a Jew. I believe in the Talmudic method. So I want to talk about the broader implications of genetics and genetic medicine for all of us. I want to start by talking just a little bit about reasoning, about rationality and reasoning itself, which is the foundation of my life. Bioethics is more than description. The discipline of bioethics is about normativity. It's about making rules and laws and norms. It's a matter of figuring out why do we act in the way we act and how can we justify it. And we also publicize our actions. So our choices become quite public, which might seem destabilizing in something as seemingly private as genetics, but they become part of the national discourse about how we should live and how we should treat our bodies. So the relationship between Jews and genes is not only the private relationship between a physician and her patient, and her own body and her children, her progeny. It is also a public relationship in which the entire discussion has a public air to it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is, especially for Jews. It's particularly vivid in genetics because it engages. Genetics is not only about your body; it's about your past and about your future. It changes time in a very interesting way, right? It's one of these rare moments in which you're both in the moment, but affected by the past and thinking always about the future. And there's a genetic test that instantiates all of that, which is really quite interesting. Now, how does normal secular bioethics and the discipline that we just heard so beautifully from Faye Shapiro about genetic counseling emerges from discussions about bioethics in the secular way without a religious component, really. And that's really based on the principles of bioethics, which are autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. You all know this. This is a very familiar thing. It has a name called the Georgetown Mantra, because those principles are repeated so often. And this notion of personal autonomy and personal choice is really the grounding principle of genetic counseling, right? And that's why it's private, and that's why it's your choice, and that's why it's your choice to decide what to do next after you receive a genetic diagnosis. So we think of it as a private act. But religion disrupts this, and I want to say that religion offers a different sort of language to think about genetics. Religion has language about sacrifice, about sin and about redemption, about birth and life and death, about families and histories. Think of our Torah, about how to refuse temptation and about why temptation is so tempting, about the ultimate limits on desire and why you put limits on desire, about how you love the stranger, even the stranger who's very unlike you, about broken people and why they're part of a community, and about mortality and about the fallenness. All of the things that genetics really touches on. Religion is the place where the language for that can be found. And in Jewish ethics, we have, in addition to those claims of religion, very distinctive methods of ethics. We use the form of question and response as a methodology. We use what we call the discursive interpretive community, not a single text, but a text that's constantly reinterpreted over centuries and presently. We understand the the necessity of reason and law, which is why conservative Judaism has such a strong law committee, because of halakha and its importance, not only for Orthodox Jews like myself, but for conservative Jews as well. We focus on the text itself, and the text directs us to the margins and locates marginality as central. And because we care about history and custom and memory. Judaism, because you've already spoken to Elliot Dorff, these are Elliot Dorff's distinctive commitments in Jewish bioethics, which are the following. The first is healing is mandated. It's not optional. Healing is mandated, a commanded act. The second is that the body does not belong to you. It's not under the autonomous control of the self. The body belongs to God. Hopefully you have a long lease, but it's not your property. Saving life is, of course, a priority. In Jewish thought, a commitment is that the natural world is not necessarily good, and the natural world is morally neutral, needs human beings to make it just or unjust. The natural world, in addition to that, is also unfinished and in need of our work, and that work is instantiated in Tikkun Olam, of course. And that another part that's important is that no knowledge is forbidden, within Jewish thought that you can learn and practice and do basic research science without forbiddenness. So embryo research, of course, permitted under Jewish law for a lot of complicated reasons, but that's one of them. And in fact, the afterlife is more fully defined not by a heaven with harps and angels, but by memory and by children and by your life work and by what you bring to this story. And all of those commitments really shape Jewish bioethics and how people think about healing and about genetics as well. Healing is a commanded act, which means that this legal theory is drawn from this arguments about farming, that just as farming, the natural world can be manipulated through farming, healing is commanded as well. And in fact, that there is a Jew really cannot live in a city without 10 things, one of them being the responsibility to have a physician on hand. You can't live in a city without a physician. It's one of the 10 things that Talmud says you need to live in a Jewish city. It includes, by the way, a doctor, a moel, a charity collection and distributed, a bathhouse, and fresh fruit. All of them having just to do with your bodily needs. There's 7 other things too. So the body, as I said, belongs to God, is to be enjoyed, is not itself sinful, and is not separate from the self or the soul. And I'm going to lift that up just for a minute, because so many times the way we talk about genetics in our language, the way we talk about DNA, you hear people talk about it as if it is the essence of the self, the essence of identity, which is a very odd thing. I mean, but it's said all the time, it's in our DNA to be fair. It's in our DNA to be just, right? Actually, Obama said it. It's in our DNA. I remember when he said it, I cringed and thought, oh no, I don't agree with that. The only thing I don't agree with Barack Obama is he thought that it was inherent in our DNA, which is ridiculous. We are made human not by our DNA in Jewish thought, but by our capacity to live in a life of obligation and duty to one another, not by our DNA. Saving a life, of course, is always a priority, unlike other religious traditions, and the natural world is morally neutral. Suffering is important. Suffering is important in religious traditions. Much of religion is erected as what Peter Berger, the theorist, calls a sacred canopy to protect you from mortality and morbidity. But for Jews, suffering is not a punishment to be understood, but a challenge to be healed. A very important difference in Jewish thought. No knowledge is completely forbidden. And Judaism is a discourse of duties and not rights. Notice how different that is from how Americans often understand their bodies or what medicine owes to them. In Judaism, the focus is, of course, on the self as an enactor of duties and not of possession of rights. One of the other duties we have is the duty to make judgments, the duty to be a guardian for our bodies and for others, the duty to read, the duty to have membership and be part of a membership community. Jews have a distinctive understanding of when life begins that's different from Catholic and other Protestant denominations. Of course, Jewish life begins at the moment of birth and not when the DNA is assembled. And that, of course, is the halakhic justification for why, if a child is carrying a disease, a genetic disease, a disorder that would be incompatible with life, or a disease that threatens the life of the mother, that the life of the mother takes precedent until the child is born. That gives the broad permissibility for abortion. It's an interesting side note when you're thinking about Jews and genetics and genetic testing and all that comes from genetic testing, which is, of course, the capacity for therapeutic abortion, should parents choose that, for not to continue a pregnancy. Of course, one of the interesting things about the current debate on abortion for Jews is not when does life begin, with the moral status of the embryo, or even the right of a woman to choose. It really has to do with the fact that moral status isn't fully obtained previous to birth. And so this notion that the moral status of the mother and child are equal just doesn't have a footing in Jewish law and Jewish practice. So there are some abortions, in fact, in Jewish law that are mandatory, that must be done if the woman's health or life, even her mental health, is at stake. And of course, a restrictive abortion law would be in contradiction with the Jewish enactment of halakha. It's an interesting side note to the abortion debate. We can talk about that later. It's kind of the subject of another story, but it touches on ours. Of course, you can't talk about Jews and genes without thinking about Rosalind Franklin. Does everyone know who Rosalind Franklin is? Am I getting nods? Yeah. Oh, I got one head shake. Dana, head shake. Rosalind Franklin, I wish I could show you I can show one slide, a beautiful picture. The beautiful Rosalind Franklin, a Jewish scholar, should have won the Nobel Prize along with Watson and Crick. She was a crystallographer, which she made crystal structures of genes, and she was the first person to make a crystallographic picture of the double helix. She was the one who figured out the protein structure of DNA. It's all due to her. Her lab partner took her picture and showed it to Watson and Crick, and it's on the basis of they looked at that picture and they understood, oh, that's how genetics works. And in fact, she died of cancer, and she died in the house of Francis Crick, who was one of her mentors. But they actually took her work and didn't credit it in their Nobel speeches. It took many, many years later until Rosalind Franklin was known to be the real discoverer of DNA. And so I always want to mention that when we think about Jews and genes, because it was a Jewish insight that about the structure of DNA itself, and that the double helix structure is a Jewish understanding, a Jewish woman's understanding. But genes themselves are really not real in the sense of tangibility. They're an artifact, right? What we call genes are clusters of information in organisms, in animals and plants and microbes. And they're, of course, inherited, but they're clusters, and then they're arbitrarily named as we think working together. For many, many years, when I taught about Jews and genes, we were told that there was a lot of what was called junk DNA or dark DNA and not known DNA that was somehow kept in the human body, but no one knew its applications. And now, bit by bit, people are decoding even the parts of the DNA that seem to us not to have an obvious function. And it really, this is one of the interesting features of thinking about genetics and thinking about elimination of genes, which is we're not entirely sure what we're doing yet. So that's one of the problems. So we know a lot about genes, increasingly knowledge, starting from Rosalind Franklin's first insights to understanding about genetic influences, to understanding the relationship between genes and environment. It's important to remember that genes aren't a thing with an on-off switch. They have like dimmer switches. Genes can be expressed more or less in larger or greater amounts. So that's why, as Faye Shapiro pointed out, sometimes tests are inconclusive for exactly that reason biologically, because genes aren't fully turned on or fully turned off. And sometimes they're on a dimmer. They're not fully expressed. Genes are expressed at different times. In fact, one of the interesting things about human embryonic stem cells is all the genes are turned on, so every cell can be anything. And maturation is a process of genes shutting down and functions of genes shutting down and fewer proteins being made as tissues become specific to just have one function. And of course, aging can be said to be the final shutting down of those processes. So all of this sounds great. When genes were first discovered, and you could snip them out and put them into different organisms and make tomatoes that had a long shelf life, make flounder that didn't freeze, take the flounder, make fish, take fish that didn't freeze, that gene, put it in tomatoes, made tomatoes able to be shipped. It all sounded kind of great. So what's the problem? Why is genetics so ethically controversial? And I think there's 5 reasons why it worries us. First is, it is a different way to observe and imagine the world. It's a theory of knowledge that the right way to understand the world is to break it down into its smallest parts. And that can feel reductionist to us. That can feel incorrect to us. That's something about seeing the DNA as the soul of the person, or the only thing that matters about a person, the thing that really determines their species being. That can seem very reductionist to us, but it changes the way we see disease. It changes the way we see identity. You've all seen that commercial for the ancestry DNA test, where someone suddenly like, I found out I was Native American, or I found out I was this, and that. She puts a hat on, and suddenly what her DNA is, what her molecular structure is, suddenly changes her identity, and we worry about that. Is that the right way to think about knowledge, about identity? Secondly, genetic medicine made very big claims early on, big claims with big languages, redemption, revolution, and whenever that happens, it should make us uneasy. We worry that claims are being made that can't be instantiated. 3 is, are we really free, or are we really fated? That's the interesting thing about genes. There are some genes that when they're discovered, single point mutations, Tay-Sachs, Huntington's chorea, you will get the disease. That is going to happen, right? Some genes are indicative of carrier status. Some genes are indicative of probabilities. To what extent are we free? If we, free to be anything, free to do anything, free of any inheritance, if our inheritance, our genetic inheritance matters so much? Fourth, are we equal? Are we not? What does it mean to have such a different genetic makeup? Are we all really the same? Well, genetically it's problematic, right? Some alleles are more advantageous. We like some alleles. We dislike other alleles. We think some genes are ones that we admire, right? Some genes, some genetic, some winners, there's winners and losers in the genetic lottery. What does that mean about equality and about the notion that equality is, we're all the same under the skin, we're all in B'Tselem Elohim, we're all the image of God, if there's this significant difference with genes. And finally, there's a disconnect between what we worry about and really the state of science. All of us understand this now after COVID, that how science is so chancy, right? Everyone's doing the best they can. I have tremendous respect for it, but really more is unknown than known, which is a very Jewish way of thinking. The world is more dark than light. That is why we build our sukkah more in shade than in sunlight, right? Because the world is as yet unredeemed for us. And that's also true of science. They're still figuring a lot of this out. So a lot of our worries are in advance of anything that could really happen. Classically, the ethical worries are this problem with genetic determinism, our worry that genes will be our fate, worries about privacy, worries about discrimination. We worry about fairness and access, about rich people having access to genetic therapies that poor not. We worry about exploitation, and we worry about the slippery slope with genetics. So I'm just going to go through all these. First of all, genetic testing. Phages did such a wonderful presentation that I don't really have to go through this, but people worry about the notion of about testing. Could it be used in a way that is discriminatory to people with disabilities? And the disability rights colleagues in bioethics have really raised this question. I want to lift up here Adrienne Ash. Adrienne Ash, of blessed memory, it was someone who was born blind and taught us never to say blinded studies, but anonymized studies. But that was one contribution to bioethics. But another one was, she said, if my parents had had genetic testing before I was born, I wouldn't have existed. And here was this wonderful Wesley professor in bioethics, and we would have to come to terms with that, about the profundity of her, the loss of her to the world. And so that's something that the disability rights activists have raised for us, and we should consider. Okay? Genetic therapeutics, there's been just a few diseases that have yielded finally with CRISPR technology, the new technology. X-linked SCIDs is one, and in at least a few cases, some blood dyscrasias have sickle cell disease has yielded to it. This is newly understood. We worry about genetic enhancements. We worry about, it's a long-standing debate about new applications, about how to consider genetic enhancement. We worry that we could use this technology to make us, well, better. So think about, for instance, let's say you wanted to first treat something like memory. Let's say you wanted to deal with Alzheimer's by changing the genes that are affected in advanced Alzheimer's. We don't know how to do that yet. We know that, of course, Alzheimer's must have a genetic component because it's cells, it's proteins, it's not fairies in the brain. It's something that's happening at the cellular level. If that could be done for Alzheimer's, then, and you can enhance memory or repair memory, should it be done for anyone else, right? Should memory enhancing applications be used more widely? And to who? All elderly people? I can't remember the name of some people that I would like to remember. That makes me sad. How about all students, right? Everybody in law enforcement, all musicians. I mean, whose memory should be enhanced? Where do you draw the line for that? If you could make muscle cells stronger to treat muscular dystrophy, and that's the dystrophin gene is one of the genes that you can know in advance. I'm sure Faye could tell us all about this gene. If you could alter that in the long muscle cells of primarily young boys who have muscular dystrophy so that they don't waste. Should you just do it for people with muscular dystrophy, or should you do it for everyone who's older? Well, what about for people who want to just run faster? Like, where do you draw the line? Should this be widely available? And to who? Considering we can't even get vaccines to most of the world's people, imagine the complexity of getting a CRISPR-based technology to most of the world's people. So, and what else would you like to do? Would you want everyone to have a better immune system? Maybe that would be good, especially now. How about stronger, or able to see complexity more, or kinder, right? Or needing to have less sleep. Like, all of these are things where there's medical interventions for them. We use drugs in all those ways, right? We use many drugs in all those ways. If we use drugs for these for these situations, why not alter the genetic code? Why? What's the reason? What's the rationale? Where's the source of that rationale? Are your genes you? What does it mean? What does it mean if you find a difference, a disabling difference? So in the UK, they actually had this debate. They had in their human fertilization embryology bill, they had a clause, number 1449, that would make the selection of certain kinds of embryos illegal. The language of the bill was this: persons or embryos that are known to have a gene, chromosome, or mitochondrial abnormality involving a significant risk that a person with the abnormality would have or develop a serious physical or mental disability, a serious illness, or any other serious medical condition must not be preferred to those who are not known to have such an abnormality. Now, what do we make of this? Doing tests for BRCA1, BRCA2 when you're an adult or a teenager is really important and useful, right? Because you might want to choose intervention therapy. But should you do it on embryos? Should you test for BRCA1 and 2 on embryos and decide not to implant a girl, for instance, a female embryo, because later in life, when she is quite older, maybe in her 50s, 40s, 50s, she may develop breast cancer, and we may still not have an answer for her in several decades. Do you just not do that because you just want to avoid cancer? Or do you think, wait a minute, not for late onset applications? And all this came into because there was a famous case of choosing deafness. Outside the UK, the positive selection of deaf donors in order to deliberately result in a deaf child has been reported. And this stems from a single case in the US about 16 years ago, when a lesbian couple, Sharon Duchesnay and Candice McCullough, both of whom were deaf, selected a sperm donor on the basis of a family history of deafness because they deliberately wanted to have a child who was deaf like them. And most of the ethical issues that have been raised center on being deaf as a negative thing, they said. But from our point of view, that we think it's a positive thing, so it's not unethical at all. We think that being deaf is a positive thing with many wonderful aspects. We don't view being deaf along the same lines as being blind or mentally retarded. We see it as a parallel to being Jewish or black. We don't see ourselves as members of these minority groups wanting to eliminate themselves. Why should we do it? And that was the case that people had to consider. Should they be allowed to choose a child with deafness? Right? So it turned out that the child wasn't deaf, even though it had a hereditary basis for it. Another thing arises around, this is very obscure, but drugs are metabolized differently by different people. It's a genetic phenomena. So for instance, arsenic is metabolized differently in different ethnicities. So what that means is that 100% of people will eventually die of arsenic if they drink a certain amount of it. But there are certain types of genetic differences that will mean that it can be 350 times more lethal, so that only a tiny amount is lethal, and types of genetic differences where even 3 times the dose is not lethal at all. And these mutations cluster together, and they're found in groups of different ethnic origins. So with that sort of genetic information, you can see the kind of evil that could be done, the kind of mischief that could be done when groups can be targeted for something like that. A lot can go wrong because a lot has gone wrong, and that's why we worry. In the United States, there was a prominent American, Charles Davenport, became a professor of biology at Harvard, And he became one of the most prominent American biologists of his time, pioneering new quantitative standards of taxonomy. And Davenport had a tremendous respect for the biometric approach to evolution. And he used that to study how mammalian development and eventually human development. In 1904, Charles Davenport became director of Cold Spring Harbor Labs, where he founded the Eugenist Records Office in 1910. And Davenport began a series of investigations into aspects of the inheritance of human personality and mental traits. And over the years, he generated hundreds of papers and several books on the genetics of alcoholism and pellagra, criminality, feeble-mindedness, seafaringness, temper, intelligence, manic depression, and the biological effects of race crossing. Davenport founded the International Federation of Eugenics in 1925, with Eugene Fetcher as chairman of the Commission of Bastardization and Miscegenation. Davenport aspired to find a World Institute of Miscegenation and was working to make a world map of mixed races, which he hated, when he introduced for the first time in a meeting in Munich in Germany in 1928. And of course, his work came to the attention of Adolf Hitler. After Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany, Davenport maintained connections with various Nazi institutions and publications, both before and after World War II. He held editorial positions at two influential German journals during and after the war, both of whom were founded in 1935. And in 1939, he wrote a contribution to a special Festschrift for Otto Reich, who became an important figure in the plan to remove populations considered inferior in Eastern Germany. So this is an important part of Jewish history. We remember this. We remember that the elimination of Jews began with the defining of Jews as different biologically and then diseased biologically. It happened as well in California, my home state. An early leading force in the field of eugenics, California became the third state in the United States to enact a sterilization bill. By 1921, California had accounted for 80% of the forced sterilizations nationwide, and this continued all the way through World War II, after which a number of sterilizations began to decrease. They were able to sterilize 20,000 forced sterilizations in California between 1909 and 1963 on the basis of Davenport's work that certain people should be eliminated and not allowed to have children. And the conditions that they eliminated were people who were feeble-minded, rebellious, disabled, runaways, people with syphilis, people who were pregnant out of wedlock, undesirables, meaning Mexicans and Indians, and incorrigibles, meaning teenagers who they really did not want. Okay. We're close to the end?
We're getting close, and I know there'll be some questions. Do you have any last thoughts you want to make?
The famous case, for Jews in particular, this dark history of eugenics does really have to be raised. Of course, there's a famous Buck versus Bell case in Virginia, but what we call this in bioethics is called the shadow of history. And the shadow of history is understood. You've probably all been to the Holocaust Museum, and notice the Holocaust Museum starts the story of the Holocaust, or the Shoah, by showing the first IBM machine made by IBM, which was used to categorize Jewish bodies, to measure noses and gaits and closeness of eyes, and to link them to syphilis and to schizophrenia. And that this notion that Jews were ill because their bodies were wrong, and it was done in the name of science at all times. And that notion, that science fear, I think is really, that raises questions, and this comes up in study after study. The final thing I want to say is this, which is, for Jewish thought, there's a cascade of issues and a cascade of concerns around genetics, but there's also a cascade of joyful optimism, because Jews in general and Jewish thought, like modernity and like science and like progress, have never shied away from it, as long as it happens within the bounds of justice. And for Jewish thought, the importance of the corners of the field belonging to the poor might allow us to think about genetics and its extraordinary power in the service of justice. And that's what will make it. That's what will make it ethical and non-ethical. One of my favorite philosophers, of course, is Emmanuel Levinas. And Emmanuel Levinas speaks of this, and he says, for Jews, justice is prior to freedom. Prior to everything, prior to freedom. And that the necessity to have genetics unfold in a world that is fair, in a world in which genetic differences is seen as important and not to be discriminated against is always going to have to go hand in glove with our tremendous joy in finding out ways to protect our children and ourselves from the enormous human suffering that many of these genetic diseases are carrying. So to conclude, I want to say two things. One is we have to ask ourselves questions about duties. We have to ask, will the pursuit of some of the science change our ideas, our characters, or our society? And finally, I want to say thank you to the Women's League for letting me come and think about this with you, and to Vivian Lieber, who called over and over and really has put together a very scholarly program. It's a very sort of serious way of thinking about these issues, and I really appreciated it. So thank you very much, and thank you for listening.
Thank you. That was wonderful. And I'd like to know, may I ask, since the book that I mentioned earlier was published in 2015, would you tell us what you're working on these days?
So let me tell you something.
Publication.
I'm having a new book coming out hopefully in a couple of months. It's all at the press. It's all being printed out as we speak, but COVID slows, the supply chain slows us. Oxford Press, so look for it. Oxford Press, it's called Second Texts and Second Opinions, Essays Towards the Jewish Feminist Bioethics. So it's about clinical ethics and the practice of clinical ethics. Shortly thereafter, also Oxford Press is a book called Ethics for the Coming Storm about climate change, about Judaism and climate change and how we can think about climate change in a Jewish way, which we desperately need to do. And then the third book I have coming out, hopefully MIT, is reviewing it now. It's a book about nature and about genetic manipulation of nature and a technique called gene drives, using gene drives to address malaria. It's the history of malaria. It has nothing to do with Jews, except Israel is prominently figured. Israel did a great job with malaria in 1920. So that's the only way that you see Jews or genes in this book. But let me tell you something else, because I'm so excited right now. I'm thrilled. I want to introduce to you someone I've just found in the world, whose name is Margaret Sussman. And Margaret Sussman, of course, was born in the 1880s and died in 1957, I believe. Margaret Sussman is a German Jewish philosopher who nobody knows, but who wrote beautiful and astonishing work in philosophy, was best friends with Barbara Pappenheim and Gertrude Kantorowicz. Barbara Pappenheim, of course, ran the Jewish organization, essentially the Jewish League of Germany, an organization that had 50,000 members until it was shut down by the Nazis in 1933. And the women deported to the camps, of course. But she was part of this very vivid, very exciting Jewish Renaissance in Germany at the time. And I want you to all read her work, newly translated for the first time in English in a wonderful book called Margaret Sussman, newly available. So if you do learn nothing else from me about genetics or Jews or women or anything else here, know that recently discovered by scholars in the field of Jewish thought is Margaret Sussman. You're going to hear a lot more from us about her because she's going to be very important, I think, as we think through what it means to be a Jew, what it means to be a woman, and what it means to think ethically.
Thank you. We can ask you, we can keep both you and Faye here for another 2 hours, but we can't do that. May I ask that you, after this program, share with me, and I'll make sure all the participants get a copy, both the names of those books. Are you hearing me? The sound is a little off. Do you hear me?
So, yeah.
The name, if you would share so that we could share it later with our audience. The names of those books you mentioned that you're going to that will come out soon. Any other details, any other further reading? Okay. If you send it to me, I'll make sure we share it.
In the chat, okay?
Well,
and I'll also send it to you.
Okay, that would be fine. It could be in a couple of days, Okay. We'd love to share further along with some of Faye's information. So thank you. It's hard to get to everything that we want to know, but thank you. You're putting some of the information here. And thank you so much. It was delightful to hear both of your presentations, Faye Shapiro and Laurie Zoloth. I look forward to seeing more of you and learning and following your work. I'd like to welcome Rabbi Ellen Wallens Fields to help wrap us up for tonight with her own thoughts, and also to invite you. First, let me invite you, if you want to reach me personally, please do so at vleber, L-E-B-E-R, at WLCJ. I look forward to hearing from you. Any ideas, anything you want to say about personal conversations, this series in general. Our next program is scheduled for May 19th. And thank you, Faye. It was delightful to meet you and to learn so much from you. And Dr. Laurie, there's such richness to this subject. We can go in every direction through the Judaism and all of our history and thought, how it relates to science and genetics in particular. We could go to the science part of it, the ethical concerns we have just as humans, and the policy concerns. And I also, so thank you for getting us to really think more deeply about this. So with that, and our gratitude, Rabbi Wallens Fields, I hand it over to you.
Thank you. This was brilliant. My mind is spinning. I might have to actually listen to it again because it was so incredible. So thank you, Faye, and thank you, Lori. And Lori, I have to say, I would love to be a fly in the room when you and Rabbi Dorff sit and talk, because your two minds together, I'm just like blown away. So it was really quite amazing. Thank you very much to both of you. And I hope everybody enjoyed their time this evening. There was a lot to take in and really digest. And Vivian, you do an amazing job organizing and facilitating. So thank you so much for everything that you do. So just a few parting words. So some genetic material we pass on to the next generation, and we can see, such as Faye was talking about, some of us might have our hair color or our eyes because our parents were like that. People always look at my sister who's blonde and say, how could she possibly be blonde when the rest of you are brunettes? Well, my father, when he, Alav Shalom, when he was alive, he didn't have much hair, but apparently when he was younger, he had blonde hair, and that's how my sister has blonde hair, and all her kids have blonde hair, and her husband's Yemenite. So you could see where he's dark. And it's important that we not only share what we see to the next generation, but our values as well. It's so important. And Lori spoke about this a little bit. We might not agree or disagree, but we'll agree to disagree respectfully, of course, that our values, I think, are also part of our genes that we do pass along, and that we have to be exemplars to others to see that. And the reason that I'm a rabbi is because of the values that my parents brought to me. This week's Torah portion, Parshat Yitro, has the 10 Commandments in it. And my parents always exemplified to me, Kaberet avicha ve'et imecha, honor your father and mother, because they were such good children to their parents. My paternal grandparents, we visited every Sunday, no matter what, even if it was for 5 minutes. Thank God they lived nearby in the same house where my father grew up, about less than a mile from where we lived. We visited them every week. And I have to say, I call if my mother was on, you could ask her the next time she's on a call with us, I call her every day. And I make sure, even if it's for 2 minutes, to check in with her. And now I have to say, I actually often video chat with her so I could see her, which pre-COVID, I never thought of doing that. But it's really awesome that I do get to do that. And that's the values that my parents passed on to me from this Torah portion this week. Honor your father and mother. And I've passed it along to my children. Thank God they see that. My daughter, Cameron, who many of you have gotten to know in some way, is in Israel this year, enjoying her time on her gap year on Nativ, the gap program between high school and college from the conservative movement. And I have to say, even with the time difference, she calls me every day, and I'm not a helicopter parent necessarily, but she calls because she wants to have the connection with me, because she sees the importance of Kaberet avicha ve'et imecha, honor your father and mother. So she calls, she texts, she video chats. I don't feel as badly that she's like thousands of miles away. And I think that some of what I've taught Cameron wasn't only honor your father and mother, but the values that I've portrayed in my life too, a passion for Judaism and a passion for women. And she's used those passions in her life in Israel, where she's become an active member of Women of the Wall. She and her friends go every month to the Kotel, to the Western Wall, to pray with Women of the Wall. February, I think she's not going to be in Jerusalem, so she might not be able to go there, but that's okay. But I'm thrilled that she's going to bring her passion for the Women of the Wall to Women's League. And you all get to also see, and Kvel for my daughter, to learn about Women of the Wall on January 30th. It's a Sunday at noon Eastern time. We'll have a Zoom with Who Owns the Wall. It's both with Women's League for Conservative Judaism. I want to thank Eileen and Lori for organizing it, Eileen Rubin and Lori Snow. And we're going to have Yochi Rappaport, the CEO of Women of the Wall. Cameron's going to be speaking also about her activities at davening there. A few other people from Women of the Wall, and also our sisters from WRJ, Women of Reformed Judaism. So I have to say that I may have passed along my eyes to her, that she looks more like my husband, but I think more so I've passed along my values to Cameron, that it's important to be a proud, loud Jewish woman who fights for rights and wears her talit and tefillin and her kippah with pride. And at the same time, not only having Ahavat Yisrael, loving Israel, but loving people in general. So I hope you'll join us again for many of our activities, especially on January 30th, when you see how I passed along my genetics to the next generation as well. And this was just a superb event. Vivian, thank you again. Lori and Faye, thank you. I know that some of the people on here have passed their genes on to Faye as well. So thank you for all the generations that are here with her, and Shabbat Shalom to everybody. And thank you to Isabel for doing all of our tech.
Thank you. Good night, and our hearty thanks to our special guests, Faye Shapiro and Professor Lori Zoloff, and to you, Rabbi Wallace Fields, to Isabel, to Grace Schessler for assisting. With that, good night, Shabbat Shalom.